Okay, I think things are up and running. It's been 2 weeks since we've been in the classroom, so we're back. We're structuring, come along with structuralism. Okay, so we last week, thank you for meeting me online. The joys of no snow days when you're a hybrid class. Every time Ms. Keegan would say, we're canceling class, they'd be like, unless you're online. I'm like, dang it, no snow days. So where we left off, we had a couple of slides left over from week 3, and then I'll get into week 4, and I'll give you some information on the exam as well, because that is coming up. Scary, but I think I have good news for you. So well, it should be, somewhat good. It's not bad news, so I. So looking at structuralism, it's basically the idea that human minds have certain universal characteristics which originate in common features of the Homo sapien brain. Basically saying, as a species, our brain is structured pretty similarly. It doesn't really change depending on things like race or sex. Our brains are pretty much operating exactly the same, unless you have like some sort of disorder that affects, then, it's going to be a little different. But one of the things that we see is people everywhere think similarly to each other. For example, humans love to classify things. We love to try and take things like nature, human activity, and organize it into binaries. We love a binary. Things like good or evil, old versus young, man versus woman. We love the idea of something fitting perfectly into a binary, meaning there's only 2 options. However, in reality, and we'll get into it a little bit in this class, take sex and gender. We like to think, okay, there's 2 genders, that is very neat and organized, and everybody fits into one of 2 boxes. And now we're finally having the conversation that both culturally and biologically, that's not really the case. There's more than 2 genders out there culturally. And when we look at biological sex, it gets a little more complicated than just XX and XY for sex chromosomes. There are other options, which we might get into in a few weeks. So realistically, nature doesn't like fitting into a binary. We try to force it into a binary, but it doesn't always work. Tied to structuralism is Claude Lévi-Strauss. He lived to, I think he actually was just shy of his 100th birthday when he passed away. But if you're wondering, it is the same last name as Levi Jeans, Levi Strauss. It's just, he's super French, so his name gets pronounced Lévi-Strauss as opposed to Levi. Levi's just kind of the Americanized version. I don't think those 2 people are related. They just have the same last name. So while humans tend to want to classify nature into a binary, realistically, it doesn't always work that way. Looking at processual approaches, this is tied into agency and practice theory. Agency refers to the actions of individuals to reshape their lives how they want it, to shape society in a way we want. All of us have agency. Now, alone and in groups, there's obviously strength in numbers. Similarly, while we all have agency, we don't all have the same level of social influence. So in other words, I'm going to pick a random change in the world. So we went through a phase where we wanted to diminish use of all single-use plastic straws. And realistically, as somebody that used to work in the restaurant business, seeing how many plastic straws get thrown away is very jarring. It's a lot of plastic going into the trash. But one of the unfortunate drawbacks is some companies then said, okay, we're doing away with all straws. And there are a lot of people with physical disabilities that require straws. So I think we need to have them accessible. I do think we need to cut back on our single-use plastic. I don't think paper straws are the solution. Those things are awful. Every time a place gives me a paper straw, I'm like, I'll just do without. I'll just throw that right in the trash. I don't want that. But I bring that up because let's say that's my preferred hill to die on. I am really focused on doing away with single-use plastic straws. I, as an individual, can lobby for that. I can post on my Instagram urging people to do away with plastic straws. I can try and lobby politicians to ban them. But as an individual, am I going to get very far? Do I have as much social capital? No. My Instagram, I'm not popular on Instagram, which I'm fine with. But being Instagram famous sounds way more taxing than it does fun in my mind. It might be because I'm older. If I was like 22, I might be like, yeah, Instagram thing. Now I'm like, that's my nightmare. So if I posted Instagram saying we should stop using plastic straws, 20 people are going to see it. Maybe 10 of my friends would like it. But realistically, they're already probably doing away with plastic straws. On friends, they'll be like, stop getting political. No, I came here for the cat pictures. But if we think of somebody like, say, Taylor Swift, lover or hater, she has a lot more social capital than me. If she took to Twitter or Instagram and said, hey, Swifties, we should do away with plastic straws, she'd probably get more people on board. She also would probably get some unfollows and people angry that that's not what they're here for. But she did. She has more pull than me. It doesn't mean that she's necessarily better than me. She just has more social capital. Practice theory is the idea that within a society, we vary in our motives and intentions and in the amount of power and influence we have. So that ties into like the social capital with like Taylor Swift. She's going to have a bigger draw than I would. Again, it doesn't mean one of us is correct and the other is wrong, but rather just that more people listen to her. And I think of it too with strength in numbers with agency. So within this situation, being in a classroom, I have a little power over you in the sense that I grade your assignments, I assign your assignments, and I have a little bit of expertise to back it up. But you all have agency. Now, that doesn't mean there's no consequences. If I came in with my agency and said, surprise, we're doing a pop quiz, don't worry, we're not. But if I said that, you do have enough agency that if you just didn't want to participate, you could get up and walk out. You could drop the class. You could be like, a pop quiz, that's ridiculous, I'm out. You have that power, and I'm pretty powerless to stop you. But if you just didn't take the quiz, my agency says, well, I can give you a 0. Now, realistically, if I came in and said, we're going to do a pop quiz, and every single one of you got up and said, no, we're not, I'd be a little powerless in that situation. I'd be like, okay, I guess we're not. Now, I could still give you all 0s, but I might take it as like, wow, you all banded together, like you organized. Honestly, I would be, with how hard it is for all of us to do group projects, I would be more impressed than anything. I'd be like, yeah, you guys all work together and decided this is impressive. That's me. I'd be easily impressed. Now, looking at anthropology today, it has become very, very specialized. When we first introduced anthropology, we talked about the 4 subfields: archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistics, and cultural. But it gets even more specific. One thing that a lot of anthropologists focus on today is people in motion, looking at nomadic people, meaning they don't have a permanent home. They usually travel with the seasons. Immigrants and refugees. Now, my differentiation between an immigrant and a refugee is that an immigrant, I'll use myself as an example. If I said, boy, I really love Irish culture, and Ireland looks beautiful, it does. I would love to see it someday. And I do, yeah, I do technically have some ancestry there. It's pretty far back, but I do. And maybe I say, you know what, America is fun, but I think I just want to live in Ireland. And I go through the channels to get my visa, passport, all that, try to get citizenship in Ireland and do it that way. That would be me immigrating. Now, I may have left my country because of undesirable situations, but I kind of left of my own accord. Versus refugees are usually fleeing. Whereas an immigrant will say, I think I'm going to immigrate to this place. A refugee kind of says, I need the heck out of wherever I am. I don't care who takes me, just somebody get me out of here. And so it's a little different, but both of these situations, you are leaving your world behind. So we focus a lot on people in motion. Humans have always traveled. We love traveling as a species. But nowadays we can travel further and faster than ever before. So it used to be if I wanted to immigrate to Ireland or say Ireland to America, I'd be on a ship for a couple months. Like it would take me a while to get here. Nowadays, it might be expensive, but I could fly there overnight and get there pretty quickly. New special interests that are showing up include medical anthropology, which we'll focus a little bit on later in the semester. Urban anthropology, looking at cities and city life, which I will also bring up occasionally today, I think today. Feminist anthropology, and I messed up my own acronym. It's LGBTQ. I don't know why I put B ahead of, I don't know. I was typing quickly. Just reorganizing the entire acronym. A great example, I don't know if the page still exists because I don't think it's as active, but there was a Facebook group called Black Feminist Anthropology, and that's where I took this screenshot. They basically are looking at, for this research, they're looking at previous research done by white anthropologists. And because it was white people going into African cultures, they were trying to perpetuate their own ideals, meaning homophobia. So basically, what now we're looking at is that these anthropologists were seeing same-sex relationship in African cultures, but they weren't reporting on it because as far as they were concerned, that wasn't allowed. We shouldn't be having same-sex relationships. So they just kind of swept it under the rug, which I bring up not to say, and then we can't trust any of the anthropologists. No, but to say they are human. Sometimes we have those implicit biases that we don't necessarily know about. We're not actively aware of those biases. Biases. I'm like, it's one of those. Looking at people in motion, we look at borders a lot. Now, if you want to look up on your own, take a look at borders around the world. Even in our own country, we have two international borders, and nowadays they kind of look very similar, but used to be a little more jarring of differences, where if you go to the Canadian-US border, yeah, there's border patrol agents. They're going to question you. Why are you here? How long are you bringing anything? All that. But my experience with the Canadian border is it's pretty chill. Yeah, they're armed, like they're border patrol agents, but they're a little more chill versus the Mexican-US border is heavily militarized. That's where we have things like border camps where people are being held against their will. Now, because this isn't like a politics class, I'm not going to make you decide on how you actually feel about those things. You get to decide that on your own. But it is an interesting development in human history where we're seeing, instead of some other borders where it's very relaxed, and yes, they, again, quiz you, ask you what you're doing there, all that, but they're way more relaxed. And then we look at the Mexican-US border, and it is a military zone, and people are being detained. I'm not gonna lie, I even got into, I'm trying to remember the name of the show, but there's a show about like border patrol and contraband. And it is amazing to see some of the things people try to smuggle in and out of any of the borders, but they do focus more heavily on it with the Mexican border. Borders can be tricky, which is an easy thing to say. But if you look at Texas, what's frustrating is not just Texas, but especially like California. When we took California, it was owned, so to speak, by Mexico. So it was populated by Mexicans because it's a Mexican part of the Mexican country. We basically invaded and took it, and now like 150, 200 years later, you have a whole bunch of white Californians going, why are there so many Mexicans here? I'm like, because you moved to Mexico. The borders have changed, but like you moved to Mexico. You can't move to Mexico and be confused why there's Mexicans where they live. Texas, similarly, has been under 5 different flags. They were under not necessarily a flag, but indigenous nations first, Mexican indigenous nations, then New Spain for a minute, they were under the France flag, and now the United States of America. So if you want to watch it on your own, there's a very short clip of an interview here with American actress Eva Longoria, who is Mexican American. And she basically talks about her family has lived on the same property in Texas for like 6 generations. And so her joke, which I love, is when somebody tells her like, well, you people just crossed the border. Her joke is, no, the border crossed us. Like, we didn't move. The border kept moving around us. And that happens a lot. I look at even my own ancestry. My late grandfather, rest in peace, was adamant that he was not Dutch, he was German. Last name was Voss. That's very Dutch. But he was adamant that he was German. And then we ended up talking to a woman who was from the same area where his family hailed. And she said, oh, funnily enough, the border between the Netherlands and Germany moved a lot. So she goes, realistically, he probably was from the same area, but when his family left, it just happened to be under the German flag. So I'm like, okay, so it's German-Dutch ancestry. Got it. But yeah, we used to tease him about that. We're not Dutch, we're German. Your last name is Voss, sir. That is very Dutch. So that is the end of week 3. I will segue into week 4, looking at HOTAC Chapter 4 and the Halili PDF. I think I have a little introductory slide. Yep, there it is. SpongeBob again. Okay, so let's see if this marker works. Yeah, I'll take it. It's always a hit or miss with markers left in the classroom. Are they going to work? I don't know. So, exam 1. How it's going to work. We will still meet here, 5:30 to 7, covering what's slated for week 5. That information will be on the second exam. So I know it's a little confusing to learn things during the week of the exam that's not going to be on the exam, but I want to give you the week to do the exam, and I don't want to shove new stuff at you and then immediately turn around and quiz you. So anything we cover next week will be tested on the second exam. Exam 1 will just be weeks 1 through 4. So whatever we get through today. If for any reason I don't make all the slides, like if I run out of time, I'm not going to quiz you on things we didn't cover. That's not fair to you, in my opinion. The exam will be online. So what it's going to look like is I will make it available to you Sunday, honestly, maybe Saturday night, but Sunday morning, and it will technically be due next Saturday at midnight. However, You cannot start it and stop it and come back. So I give you the whole week to pick a time that works for you. Set aside about an hour and a half. That is how long I will give you, because that's when we normally meet, is an hour and a half. It probably, for a lot of you, won't take the whole hour and a half, but set aside an hour and a half just in case. I don't want you to be like scrambling. So in other words, ideally, don't start it Saturday at like 10:59. You can do it, but I would not recommend it. It's timed, so I give you about an hour and a half, give or take. And I think if you run out of time, it just kind of submits it. So make sure you're keeping an eye on the time. Let me think of other things. Yes, you can use your notes. That's my good news, hopefully. You can use your notes. So realistically, even in the real world, am I an expert in this subject matter? Yeah, I went through a lot of education. I've been teaching for years. Even I have to check my notes sometimes. One of you might stump me this semester. You might ask a question that I kind of know the answer to, but I second guess myself. And I will tell you, let me double check my notes and get back to you. So even in the real world, I check my notes. Now, that being said, there is a study guide online under week 4, I believe. Take a look at it. If you have it. Notes. And that. Take a look at the study guide. Take a look at your notes. The reason why I'm okay with using open book or open notes during the exam is if you haven't been here, if you haven't been paying attention, in an hour and a half, you're not going to be able to look up every single answer without any like knowledge going into it. So you still got to pay attention, but the notes are just kind of, use them as a backup. How's the exam set up? So what I think it will be is it'll be worth 100 points. You will have 10 matching. I might be a little off on my numbers, but about 10 matching, give or take 15 multiple choice, about 4 short answer, which I will tell you my differences here, and about 4 or 5 essay. This might be 4 to 5. I'm trying to remember. So my difference between short answer and essay is just the length of what I'm requiring. So a short answer question is going to be something like, in your own words, define natural selection, something like that. And I'm going to expect 1 to 2 sentences in your answer. Essay questions are going to be a little more in depth. It would say something like, in your own words, define natural selection, but also give me an example in which natural selection worked well and one where it didn't work well. That's not a question that's on the exam, but that's kind of the similarities. It'll have multiple parts. That answer, when I say essay, I don't mean a full essay. I mean 4 to 6 sentences. That's how I differentiate between the two. So 10 matching, 15-ish multiple choice, 4 to 5 short answer, 4 to 5 essay. I'll try to include an extra credit question, give you some little easy one for you. Let me think if I'm forgetting anything. Do we have any questions on the exam? Okay. If you do, feel free to ask me, leading into this. You're allowed to ask coming up to it. I will try to keep like my phone and everything active next week so that if you have any technical issues with the exam, reach out to me ASAP. Feel free to text me if you need, because that'll go to me very fast. So I will keep an eye out in case there's any issues. That's how the exam's going to work. Okay, cool. So cool. I'll segue in. So looking at the 2 dimensions of anthropology, there are 2, academic and applied. Academic anthropology is when you are conducting research strictly with the goal to publish for other academics. So looking at my own research, when I got my master's degree, I studied women truck drivers, and I wrote a master's thesis. That was written from an academic standpoint with other academics in mind. I didn't write it for the average person to pick up and read, meaning you would have to know a little bit of the jargon. If you're not an anthropologist, you might have to Google, like, what does that mean? Oh, okay. Versus academic anthropologists would read it and go, oh, I know who she's talking about. Oh, I know what she means. Applied is the use of anthropology to solve contemporary problems. What I would like to do, I know it would cost money, so that's kind of a barrier, but I would love to take my research on safety over the road and turn it into like a free pamphlet that I could leave with like safety tips for truckers and other drivers, women or everybody else. Maybe geared towards women because that was my research, but anybody could use it. And I would like to then print those off and put them in truck stops. That is me taking the research I did and not just saying, wow, it's dangerous being a truck driver, but saying, hey, it's dangerous being a truck driver. And here are some tips I've collected from other drivers that might help you. It's me trying to solve a real world problem. Some great examples of applied anthropology. You can do applied anthropology in any of the 4 subfields, but some great examples is garbology, which I will probably get to today. Yes, it is the study of garbage. Historic preservation, when we're looking at buildings or just historic sites. Sometimes it's an actual building that we're saying, okay, it's over 100 years old, let's put it on the historical landmark. Sometimes it's historic preservation of just sites. Sometimes it's something like burial mounds, where if you're just driving by, it just looks like a field with some hills in it. But then there's a little placard off to the side that says, no, this is from the Anishinaabe people 30,000 years ago, and people have been buried here the entire time. It's historic preservation. And we'll get into a little bit later in the semester medical anthropology. That is looking at traditional medical systems, how they work, how we can incorporate them into biomedicine or Western medicine. So we'll spend a whole week talking about traditional medical systems like traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic. And what's uplifting to me is that finally in the 2020s, and a little before, Western medicine is finally recognizing that things like traditional Chinese medicine have been around for, say, 5,000 years because they work. Now, does that mean if you break a bone that you can just rub a poultice on it and be fine? No, you should probably still go to a doctor and get that set and put a cast on it. But if it's something like chronic headaches, there may be a tea that could help you. And the Chinese people have been doing this for thousands of years. So I'm grateful that Western medicine is finally like, man, it might actually work if they've been doing it for that long, and kind of looking into it. You don't have to memorize this little chart I made, but I tried to take the 4 subfields and give you an example of applied anthropology in each subfield. Cultural anthropology can look like development anthropology, where you're looking at the development of other nations, looking at how the Western world is affecting the rest of the world, and looking at how cities form. Physical anthropology, it usually gets put into forensic anthropology. Forensic just means when you're combining science with the law. So forensic anthropology is like the show Bones, where, or CSI, where you have somebody in a lab coat that works with a deceased person, and, all that's left is like charred bones. And they're able to look at that and say, she was a Latina American woman who was born in Guatemala but moved here in her teens, and cause of death was strangulation. And you're thinking, how in the heck did you get all that? A lot of science, a lot of training. It may not be as exciting as like CSI or Bones, but it is a real job. Archaeology usually gets transferred into cultural resource management. I don't know if I bring that up again today, but I might get ahead of myself. I have friends that work in CRM, and one of them lives in Arkansas. Well, her and her husband both work in the same company. That's how they met. Basically, we went to grad school together. So she also did a master's thesis, but on archaeology. Now she works for a company in Arkansas where if a company is going to build something like a building, a cell tower, a highway through land that is undeveloped, her company goes out and surveys the land and comes back to the company and says either there's nothing here, you're good to build, go ahead, or they come back and say, ooh, bad news, we actually found human activity and we think it's about 30,000 years old. And so we need to excavate this before you destroy it. Because if you pave over it, we're never going to get that information. Yeah. And a lot of times they have a very tight deadline because that other company is now breathing down their neck like, we want to build, we want to build. So I laugh because if we think of archaeology, we think of like Indiana Jones and finding like human remains. And in CRM, I realistically said, oh, is it like exciting if you find human remains? And she said, no. Do you know how much paperwork is involved if we find human remains? So she said, we actually love it when we find nothing, because then we get to go back to the client and say, you're good, go ahead and build. They're happy, we get paid. I'm like, okay. Linguistics can be transferred into the study of linguistic diversity in classrooms, looking at the languages spoken by students and teachers, looking at bilingual classrooms, or even looking at trendy new language that comes out of classrooms. I'm going to admit, I'm in my early 40s, and I have never felt my age more than when 6'7" became popular, and I still don't know what it means. And I've just kind of accepted that I'm never going to know what it's not for me to know. It's for my nephew to find hilarious, and I will stand there and think, I'm sure there was some random crap I said at 8 years old that my parents went, what the heck is she talking about? I've just accepted, nope, I'm too old. I'm never going to know what it means. It's just a mystery to me. Looking at anthropology and our relationship to indigenous groups. So indigenous pretty much just means the people that were there first. We're all technically indigenous to somewhere. But for North America, we're referring to like Native Americans, American Indians. Bronislaw Malinowski, if you remember him from last week and the week before, he thought that applied anthropology meant working with colonial powers. So he would come into an indigenous group that was being actively colonized, and Malinowski thought the anthropologists should, getting tongue-tied, should side with the colonizers rather than the indigenous people. And because of that belief in a lot of anthropologists, we ended up kind of ruining our relationship with indigenous communities in some situations. Not all of them, some were great relationships, but this is Floyd Red Crow Westerman. He passed away a few years back. He was an actor, an activist, and a musician. And he wrote a song, it's linked at the bottom of the slide if you want to watch it on your own, called Here Come the Anthros, talking about growing up on an impoverished Native American reservation. And when he was a kid, he would have anthropologists come out in the summer to study them. And basically what he's talking about is feeling like a freak being studied. So I won't sing it, but he says, the anthros still keep coming, like death and taxes to our land, to study their feathered freaks with funded money in their hands. Basically saying he's sitting as a kid in an impoverished nation where poverty is the main issue everyone is facing. And here come anthropologists that are mostly white people. They look nothing like the indigenous community. So they stand out that way. They're dressed differently. They just got funding for their research, which means they went out and bought a new camera, a new voice recorder, new notebooks, all of that, which as an anthropologist, I understand is necessary to document all of our research. But it felt to Floyd here a little like they were rubbing his nose in it, of like, we have tons of money, sucks that you're poor. And then to really make it feel like a freak on display, the anthropologist would basically interview them, take pictures of them, talk to them, and say things like, wow, you guys are really poor. I'm going to write a research paper on it and probably get more funding because of how poor you are, and then do nothing to help. And I do not blame Floyd at all for being pissed off about that. I would be pissed off too. It makes it feel like if you are actively drowning and an anthropologist shows up to take a picture of you and be like, wow, you are going to die, and then just walk away. I would also be like, can I have some help? Can you help me with this? So thankfully, nowadays, we are kind of rebuilding that relationship. We go into it knowing they may not be happy to see us. And we try to then say, okay, if I do the research and you're dealing with something like poverty, instead of just publishing an article that says, hey, they're dealing with poverty, I should also publish it elsewhere. I should publish it for the general public. I should maybe talk to the politicians in the area, try to help lobby, try to get activism going, try to get funding, help them rather than just study them like they're zoo animals. And while I'm not a full Disney adult, it did make me think of Pocahontas. These white men are dangerous. I'm like, yes, yes, American history. So the two people I have up there, it's to show that historically there were some anthropologists that were trying to do good. Henry Louis Morgan, we talked about last week, he advocated for the Seneca and Iroquois people as their lawyer. Now, he was a little outdated in some of his beliefs, but for the time in the 1800s, he was pretty progressive. This is a modern example, Barbara Rose Johnston. She worked with an indigenous community that was going to have a dam put in. When we build dams, it completely changes the landscape. It floods one part of the landscape and it minimizes the water in the other part of the landscape. And so this indigenous group knew, like, you are going to greatly alter our ancestral land and really mess us up. Now, the unfortunate reality is, I think they still went ahead and built the dam, but Johnston here was a really strong advocate for the indigenous groups to try and help them sway politicians to move the dam. Didn't really work, but she at least was trying. So we work to repair that relationship. Applied anthropology allows a way to do more than just report back, to do more than just say, hey, I'm going to study you like a zoo animal and then tell my boss about it. Yeah, we're still going to do that a little bit. That's kind of part of anthropology, to study people, but we're also going to build relationships. We're not just going to sound so cheesy, but we're there kind of to make friends. Yeah, not just make friends that are going to like braid each other's hair and have like a fun girls' night, but rather to say, like, I'm here to help you. I'm here to advocate for you, while also studying the different cultures. And we see a lot of indigenous activism around water protection. I'll bring that up again in a few weeks when we talk about indigenous North America. But we see that a lot because water is life. We all need clean drinking water to survive. And I will try not to go on a tangent. That's why I get so mad about AI. Not only is it crappy, it's using so much clean drinking water. So it drives me bonkers when somebody's like, I used AI to turn my cat into an elf. And I'm like, that's adorable. How much water did you just waste? That's me being like annoying to my friends. I'm also annoying, but I've fallen for a few AI videos. Holy crap, my dad is 79. Every day he's like, do you see that video? You see that video of the guy doing a magic trick for a gorilla? And I'm like, Dad, that was AI. I saw a bear using a snowmobile. No, you did not. No, you did not. But I also, in some instances, I'm like, oh, he's 79. Let him have fun. If he's like, it's amazing, the bear is using a snowmobile. Sure, Dad. Great. Awesome. Yes. Yes. Now, speaking of my elders, My dad is 79, so he is the very beginning of the baby boom. How we got into academic anthropology. You've heard of baby boomers. If you're unaware of why they are called that, basically, little thing happened called World War II. And once America got involved, we sent a lot of men overseas. We also sent quite a few women, but majority men. And a lot of those men left wives and girlfriends. My grandparents, my dad's parents, were separated for, I think, about 2 years while married. And so what happened is, when I sound like a parent describing, when two people love each other, no, but when two people miss each other romantically, what do you do to celebrate when you haven't seen each other in 2 years? Babies happen. That's what happens. So basically, you had a whole bunch of couples being reunited and getting pregnant because they missed each other. And so then we had a huge influx or a boom of babies being born between 1946 and 1957. So cut to 18, 20 years after the baby boom, all of this huge generation is now going to college. Not only is it a big population going to college, but college at the time was more accessible and affordable than ever before. Pre-1950s, women were not going to college as often. They were, but not as often as nowadays. And so we saw an influx of different genders, different races getting into college, and we needed more affordable options. So we started seeing junior colleges pop up, which are now known as community colleges. In these colleges, anthropology was taught as a required course. So it had ripple effects because now you have a whole bunch of people learning about anthropology, some of them majoring in anthropology, and then going into the workforce. So pre this time period, where you're going to find anthropologists were pretty much universities and museums. I think my favorite exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago is there is an actual laboratory where you can watch the scientists work. And I think it's a silly dad joke, but kind of like on an aquarium, they have a sign that says, like, please don't tap on the glass. It confuses scientists, like you would have on an aquarium. And I don't know why that's delightful to me. I actually knew somebody that worked in that lab for like a year, and I asked her, I was like, is it weird to get used to just the general public staring at you? And she's like, yeah, it's a little weird. Like, it is kind of cool to see them working though. So we mostly find anthropologists in academia and museum work. Where that started to change into the 1970s and 80s, you had the baby boomers now as adults entering the workforce. They started going into government jobs, hospitality, as well as hospitals, unions. Technically, unions isn't really like a job, but you would see more forming of unions. Social movements, also not necessarily a job, but we saw a lot of activism, and corporations. There are corporate anthropologists. I tried to work in corporate America I made it 4.5 years. It was not a good fit for me. I am grateful that like some of my friends still work at that company and they're thriving. They're doing great. So I know it's just me. Like they're doing great. It was just me that wasn't a good fit. One of the reasons was I was kind of obnoxious culturally because I had just come out of grad school. And so they would say things like, I think our theme for the party should be the Wild West. And I had to be the bummer to say, oh, okay, on paper, that sounds lovely because you're thinking cowboys. That sounds great. But you're a really big company, and there will be photos taken at this event, will be put on social media. And if you choose the theme Wild West, somebody who is not indigenous is going to show up in a Native American costume. And if you get photos of that, it's going to be a PR nightmare. And they didn't want to hear it, but they also agreed, like, no, you're right. And I'm like, I think it would be offensive. But even if you don't want to think offensive, it'll be a PR nightmare for your company. And they're like, so I think we chose like Disney princesses as the theme. And I'm like, yeah, it's a little safer. Looking at applied anthropology today, shedding. There we go. We look at theories and methods for confronting human and global problems. So again, with CRM, the cultural resource management, they are trying to combine commercial goals with academic goals. So where it gets frustrating is some of the critiques of archaeology I've heard, which I understand, is that maybe we shouldn't be digging up humans. Maybe we should leave them in their resting place. And I do understand that because it's kind of a conflict I have where sometimes we will find something like a mummy and I'll think, oh my gosh, we're going to learn so much from this mummy about the culture that doesn't exist anymore. This is going to be great. But I also have that gut feeling of like, put her back in her resting place. I bring that up because with CRM, a lot of times, the options are dig up the human remains and put them in a museum or let them get completely destroyed. And so for that kind of which side are we going to pick, I'm okay with us digging them up. So in instance, if you have like a burial site and the government is saying we have to build a highway through that site and we cannot reroute the highway, it has to go through that site. CRM will get however many months they have to excavate as quickly as possible because they know if they don't excavate those human remains, they're going to get like chopped up and ground up. And that is, in my opinion, a little more disrespectful. So realistically, I would love if we could keep all the human remains in the ground where we left them, but it is how we study past civilizations. And this might be easy for me to say as an anthropologist, and it's easy to say because it's not a real life issue. I've lost my grandparents, all of them by now, and they're all buried, different parts. 2 of them are in Muskegon. If for some reason the government said we have to uproot that entire cemetery, and your options are either we can house your grandma's remains in a museum, or she's going to get ground up and paved over. I would probably say, put her in a museum. Now, mind you, that's easy to say because it's not a real life situation I'm going through. And rest in peace, Grandma. Y'all didn't know her, but she was a star. So I think she would actually love to be on display in a museum. She would probably be like, yes, everyone come see me. But it's kind of a tough decision to make. Now, when we talk about development anthropology, if you want to watch a snippet of this man, it is linked on the slide below. There is, the third bullet point is a block quote about him. Don't panic about memorizing that. Whenever I put a really long quote up there, it's not that I want you to memorize it. It's just a quote I thought was important. So development anthropology is a field that examines the sociocultural dimensions of economic development. This is Arturo Escobar, born in 1952. He is a Colombian-American anthropologist. The snippet video is from a longer lecture of his about development anthropology. And what he's kind of looking at is, so even the terms we use have changed over the years. We used to use the terms first world and third world countries, but we're getting away from that because it makes it sound like we're ranking them, like we're saying first world is better or more advanced or things like that. So then I hear the terms developing nations versus third world countries. And realistically, that also isn't perfect because it makes it sound like they're less advanced than the rest of us, like they're not as far developed. But it is a little better than third world countries. But it's looking at countries that don't have the industry that what used to be the first world or developed nations have, the Western world, Europe, North America, parts of Asia and the Middle East. All of them would be considered developed nations because they have things like highways and high rises and factories and things like that, versus a smaller nation like the Kungsan in sub-Saharan Africa would be considered a developing nation because They do not have that kind of industry. Escobar basically talks about that development was unavoidably both an ideological export and a simultaneous act of cultural imperialism. Basically talking about the influence countries like in the Western world, like the US or England or Japan, the influence we have over other nations. Oftentimes, it's less about a choice to say, yes, I would like to be westernized, I would like to live like they do in America. And instead, it's just kind of cultural imperialism. They're not being forced, but they're not really given another option. I think of, I'll probably bring it up again, but I think of McDonald's. McDonald's is an American invention, and McDonald's is now found all over the world. And love it or hate it, it's kind of genius adaptability. One of the reasons why McDonald's has done well all over the world is they adapt to the country they move to. So here, they're serving Big Macs, chicken sandwiches. You go to Germany, you can get a Frankfurt and a beer at a McDonald's. You go to Japan, you're going to get like a shrimp burger. You go to India, the majority of Indians are vegetarian, and they especially respect cows. So they're not serving beef burgers, they're serving chickpea burgers. Like, I kind of hate how adaptable McDonald's is because it's just invasive. But I'm also recognizing, like, from a business standpoint, that's genius. That is genius to just adapt. They knew if they just moved to India and sold cow burgers, nobody was going to buy them. But yeah, there is not a McDonald's. I think it's a Pizza Hut in Egypt, in Cairo, where you can sit on the balcony and eat your personal pan pizza and gaze at the pyramids. And that is both amazing and horrifying. Like, on one hand, I'm like, I kind of want to go to that Pizza Hut. And on the other hand, I'm like, why is Pizza Hut in Cairo? Like, why? What are we doing there? Also, I promise, if I ever get my butt out to Egypt, I'm not eating Pizza Hut. I can have Pizza Hut here. I almost fought somebody, not actually like a physical fight, but I almost argued with somebody because he got me good. He was messing with me. I went on a trip years ago to not international, just New York City. I'd never been. And we were in Times Square because that's where our hotel was. And we were trying the first night to figure out where to get dinner. And I'm thinking like some little hole-in-the-wall New York restaurant. And that man literally said, we should go to Olive Garden. And I was like, get out. I am not going to Olive Garden in New York. And that's when he started laughing. I was like, I'm kidding. I'm like, don't. I did not come all this way to go to Olive Garden, Applebee's. Like, we have that at home. No offense, I do love Olive Garden, but like, not necessarily authentic. Mind you, my dad of the generation that he is convinced Olive Garden is five-star dining. We only go to Olive Garden for our birthdays. One day I got Olive Garden to go on like a random Tuesday, and he was shocked. It's like, they have to go? I'm like, yeah, it's Italian Applebee's, Dad. Like, it's delicious, don't get me wrong, but like, not like a Michelin five-star restaurant. But at least he's easy to impress. I know on his birthday, I'm going to be like, you want to go to Olive Garden? Of course you do. Let's go. Now on the way home, I'm going to be like, do I want this? We're all going to end up at the nearest Olive Garden. I know. Table for 20, please. I'll get back on track. I'll stop talking about breadsticks. So to try and be more innovative, we do try to maximize our social and economic benefits, and we do that by making sure our projects are holistic. When we are instituting a project in a new community, we have to be culturally compatible. Think of McDonald's. They're adaptable. They know India isn't going to buy beef, not in droves like America does. We also have to respond to locally perceived needs. I witnessed a company not be receptive to that many years ago in downtown Grand Rapids when the craft beer craze was at its height. I was going into grad school, so I was really broke that summer. And I got a job at a restaurant called Bagger Dave's, which is technically a chain, but there's not too many. They went in downtown Grand Rapids and were convinced they were going to make bank, but they were not paying attention to what Grand Rapids wanted. They wanted craft breweries. They wanted small batches like that. They didn't want a chain to sling burgers and bigger name brands. They wanted small. Now, they also put it in a terrible location with bad parking. It was awful. That was also the same summer I learned how to sell my plasma because we were not making any money. Oh, we need to involve both men and women, as well as I would argue other genders, in planning and carrying out the changes that affect them. Different genders may have different needs. So look at truck driving. When we first put in truck stops, it was mostly men. So they were not two separate showers. There was just one shower because we assumed they're all men. They can all have the same locker room. And then they suddenly realized, wait, there's women out there working? Oh, crap, they don't want to be in the same locker room as the guys. So we had to do a little bit of a different shift. We need to harness traditional organizations. Think of what that society already has in place. Think of even in our own culture. If I wanted to say, okay, maybe Muskegon has a high population of elderly or people with physical disabilities who can't get out of their house. And I think we should institute some sort of organization to bring them home-cooked meals. Realistically, the first thing I should Google is, does Muskegon have a Meals with Wheels program? Because if they already have it, then I shouldn't work on creating a competing organization. I should maybe look at, okay, well, how can I help the Meals with Wheels program have a wider range or get more funding or something like that? And be flexible. We're working with humans. When I was in undergrad, one of my roommates was a math major going into grad school. The way her brain worked does not make sense to me. I was like, kudos. To be fair, though, I can write an essay tonight, and that is not how her brain works. So I was like, you help me with math, I will help with humanities. But I bring that up because we were both doing research to prep for grad school. And I had a day where I had set up an interview with a truck driver. We were supposed to meet at like 5 p.m. I was going to buy her dinner, and we were going to talk, and I was going to get this great interview. And at about 4 p.m., she texted me and said, I don't want to do it. And I said, is there like a reason, like something I can help with, or don't want to do it? And I just had to say, okay, I can't force her. Yeah, she signed my informed consent, but that's not a contract. She's a human. She's allowed to just say, I don't want to do this anymore. And I was pretty disappointed because I thought it was going to be a good interview. And Beth, my roommate, was like, that's really weird. And I said, well, it's humans. Because realistically, her being a math major, when she sits down to do her research and her calculating, I'm not saying it's easy. It's definitely not easy for me. But the number 3 is never going to just refuse to participate, versus humans can just go, I don't want to do this anymore. And we have to just adapt and be like, I guess I'll find somebody else. I have 2 long vocab words today. Over-innovation is the first one. This is trying to achieve too much change at once. The goals and values of people who farm and fish for a living differ from those of people who work for cash, just as they differ from those of development planners. So basically saying, as anthropologists, when we come into a new culture or society and we want to say make changes to help them, that's all well and good, but we can't change everything overnight. I have up there a picture of Saudi women after voting, because Saudi Arabia, combining 2 countries, Saudi Arabia has very recently given the right to vote to women. For a long time, they weren't allowed. And so when they finally could vote, they had really big numbers come out. Like, they were pretty excited. And you also saw some men that were angry. There's a little snippet from a news article linked below this slide where they interview a man who says you can show his ideas around women in his response. They said, how do you feel about women getting the right to vote? And he said, if she's voting, who is watching my sons? And I was like, no, a nanny, a babysitter, a cousin? I want somebody slightly older. But the reason why I bring up Saudi Arabia is a lot of American women will look at Saudi women and know, okay, they didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to drive. They're just now getting those rights. Legally, I believe they have to be fully covered head to toe, except for their faces. There are a few Arab countries that have laws like that. For a lot of American women, we view it as oppressive because we think, well, I love picking out my outfit every day. I don't want someone to tell me I have to wear that black dress and only that black dress. And so sometimes American women will think, well, we need to go in and liberate them and completely change their entire way of life to be just like ours. And realistically, what we need to do is talk to the actual Saudi women and say, what do you want? What do you want to have happen? And realistically, while a lot of them were fighting for like the right to drive, some of the women didn't want to. They were like, no, I love having a driver. Realistically, it was usually the wealthy people because they could afford a driver versus the rest of us that were broke. If you couldn't drive, you just didn't go anywhere that day. So, it's usually the wealthy that are like, no, if you're wealthy, you can still have a driver. Like, we're not forcing them to drive. We're just giving them the option. There's my other long word, under differentiation. When we see less developed countries as all the same and ignore cultural diversity. So similarly, I mentioned that there are a few Arab countries where women, it's dictated how they can dress. But that doesn't mean we can't, that was a terrible sentence. That doesn't mean we should assume that they're all identical. Saudi Arabia is going to be quite different from the United Arab Emirates. It's going to be quite different from Qatar. And similarly, they're geographically nearby places like Pakistan, but they're also going to be very different. So we can't lump them all in together. Look at, a lot of us are very proud to be American, and think of if you traveled and everybody just assumed you were Canadian. Now, there aren't too many terrible stereotypes about Canadians, so you may not be offended that people think you're Canadian, but you might spend your entire trip trying to tell people, no, it's not Canada, it's Michigan. It's close, but we do technically have differences. So we need to make sure that we're not just assuming they're all the same. And similarly, just because something works for one country doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly for a neighbor. A great example is property, concepts of property. So here, we love really hard property lines. If you buy property, you can get an actual printout. You can go, I think the website is like HomeSnap, but you can go online and plug in an address and it will give you an aerial shot of the property lines because we want to know exactly where our property starts and ends. But in a lot of other cultures, it's less rigid than that. Yeah, you kind of know like this general area is mine, but it overlaps with my neighbor, and really where the land kind of overlaps, we're not too critical about who does what there. And then colonizers like us will come in and say, no, you have to have very strict property laws, property lines, and social units. It's better to use the indigenous models for change rather than trying to force our own way of life on another group. Looking at anthropology and education, it's the study of students in the context of their family, peers, and enculturation. So looking at multicultural approaches to teaching. Even this class, the reason why it's a little difficult being a hybrid class, but the reason why, like the exam, I try to do a bunch of different types of questions is because I think of my roomie from undergrad who's a math major. Our brains work differently. We were studying for the GRE, which is the graduate college entrance exam. And like a lot of standardized tests, there's an English portion, there's a math portion. I'm trying to remember the other portions. It's been a long time, but English and math. And so we literally did help each other out because our brains just worked differently. When it was time to study for math, she helped me out. When they said, go write an essay, I helped her out. I'm not saying I'm an expert at essay writing, and she is an expert at math, but we at least helped each other out. That's why I try to have different approaches. It's also why, I don't know if anyone said that, even though we're a hybrid class, I will put that out there. If any of you know I do terrible with online exams, I would rather do it in person. Reach out to me as soon as possible. I don't think there's another class in here after we're done. Worst case, I will print out a printer paper copy and we will hang out in here after class and do the exam. I'm willing to work with you. Multicultural approaches to teaching. I'm trying to be inclusive in my lesson planning. It's also why I like to occasionally incorporate labs or group projects or videos, because I know just standing here talking at you for an hour and a half every day might get a little droning on and you might start to lose attention. Now, urban anthropology is looking at cities, how cities are organized, who lives there. It's the cross-cultural and ethnographic study of urbanization and life in cities. 55% of Earth's population lives in cities, which is a little over half. What's fascinating is the bigger the city and the more immigration you get to that city, the more likely you are to have what's called an ethnic enclave. It is a geographic area with high ethnic concentration, characteristic cultural identity, and economic activity. A great example is like Chinatown in New York City. It's called Chinatown because it has a lot of Chinese immigrants. Think of it this way. Let's say you're a Chinese immigrant and you are traveling to the US in the 1800s and you have to go by boat. It'll take a few months because you're going around the globe. And on that boat, you start to talk to the other immigrants. And they're all coming from China, maybe different cities in China, but they all came to like Beijing to get on the ship. And you start to talk to them and you make friends. And then when you get to the city, it's a brand new city. The language is different, the culture is different. You got to figure out where to live. Why not be neighbors with those new friends you just made and get apartments nearby? Now you've got a little taste of home. Because even if you move to that new country willingly, you're still going to get homesick. Even living on the other side of the country. I lived in Washington State and San Diego for a while. And you know what I really, really missed? Chili dogs. There were not that many chili dog places. Occasionally some, but they just weren't as good as the Midwest does. I missed my chili dogs. So similarly, if I lived next to somebody from Michigan, they might call me up one day and say, hey, I decided to revamp this recipe. I made chili dogs. Do you want to come over? And I'm going to be like, hell yeah. Similarly, these Chinese immigrants may say something like, hey, I made egg rolls because there are no Chinese restaurants around us. Would you like an egg roll? And you get a little hint of home. Realistically, I don't know if egg rolls are an American cuisine or if they exist. They probably are a little different here than in China. I know things like orange chicken are an American Chinese. Delicious, don't get me wrong. But I know like people in rural China are not eating orange chicken. I am. So you end up with this little enclave. And looking at Chinatown in New York, that is where signs are in Mandarin. They're also in English, but they're also in the Chinese written language. People are going to be speaking Mandarin or Cantonese on the streets. And you do have economic activity. So thinking of New York specifically, okay, learn from my mistakes. As thrilling as it might be, don't follow random people to go buy knockoff handbags. It's really dangerous. I went into an underground lair and I remember sitting in this back room looking at these cheap knockoff handbags, thinking, is a fake Prada bag worth death? I don't know. Probably not. Am I going to die here? I was all of like 25. And yeah, we literally just followed somebody to go buy knockoff handbags. Don't do that. So the bag was not worth it. The like little Prada thing fell off like a week later. Like it was not worth it. It was an adventure. It's an interesting story. But yeah, you have actual economic activity where you have a lot of people in Chinatown. It's a big industry to do knockoff designer bags and clothing. But it is also illegal. Don't do that activity. You didn't hear that from me. No, I didn't. I did illegal activity. Configurationalism. Okay, that's also a kind of long word, but it's the view of culture as integrated and patterned. I have another long quote, so you don't have to write it down and memorize it. It's from Ruth Benedict, who we met her last week. She says, I have faith of a scientist that behavior, no matter how unfamiliar to us, is understandable if the problem is stated so that it can be answered by investigation, and if then studied by technically suitable methods. And I have the faith of a humanist in the adventures of mutual understanding of men. Basically saying that as anthropologists, we have to have faith in human nature. That yes, sometimes human nature can be violent, but for the most part, through most of human history, we've been trying to understand each other, and we've been traveling, and we've been trying to understand, okay, they do things differently from us, but why? And so she's kind of saying, as long as we keep that spirit alive of that wanting to understand, that will help us in solving giant world problems that affect all of us. Medical anthropology, I already gave you a little bit of info on. It is the comparative bicultural study of disease, health problems, and healthcare systems. Technically, to differentiate between disease and illness, a disease is a scientifically identified health threat caused by a known pathogen. So think of something like coronavirus. We know what causes coronavirus. We know how to avoid it, and we know how to treat it. I don't know that we actually have like a full cure, but we at least know some things that can help with it and ways to avoid it. Illness is a condition of poor health perceived or felt by an individual. That is a little harder to pinpoint, to nail down. Think of like mental illnesses, something like depression. We're still trying to figure out exactly what causes it. We know it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, but we're still trying to figure out. Sometimes it's hereditary, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's reflective of a big event happening. Sometimes it's just every day. I will fully admit with my mental health, there are some days where I wake up and my brain chemistry says, I'm really sad today. And I'm like, hi. And my brain has nothing to offer me, just sad. And I'm like, okay. Sometimes it's just that chemical imbalance. We're trying to figure out mental illnesses. Are they hereditary? Is it genetic? Or is it environmental? And realistically, it's a little bit of both. And we're still trying to kind of figure out. And there is no, quote, cure for depression, a mental illness. Are there medications that can help? Yes. Going to things like therapy, meditation can also help. But it's not an overnight cure. What medical anthropologists are doing is trying to be proactive. So how can we improve the health of, say, indigenous people? When we look at like North American indigenous people, a lot of the people that live on reservations, a lot of those reservations have poverty and very bad health. Diabetes is one of the things that's affecting them a lot. And we can be proactive, identify their most pressing health problems. maybe we go in thinking diabetes is going to be what they want to talk to us about, but then we get there, and unfortunately, there's also a lot of battle with suicide and depression on reservations. So maybe in talking to people, even people who are diabetic, they say like, well, no, I've pretty much got my diabetes under control. It's not great, but it's under control. But I just lost somebody to suicide. And then you talk to them about that, and you find out that's a way more pressing health concern. We gather information on possible solutions. Thinking of diabetes, one of the things, if we're talking type 2 diabetes, which is not hereditary, that is usually from poor diet. And unfortunately, in more poor neighborhoods, like on reservations, you don't have as good of access to healthy foods. So it's kind of that struggle we see in America, where we say, oh my gosh, everybody is so unhealthy. Why is everyone so unhealthy? And then we don't pay anybody enough to eat healthy. And we're like, well, why is this happening? One of the reasons. And we need to implement solutions to try and help them. But we need to partner with agencies that are already in charge. Looking at different disease theory systems. Personalistic is when you blame illnesses on agents, such as sorcerers, witches, ghosts, or ancestral spirits, which for most of us in modern America, we don't do that. However, there are many, many modern societies that do. And one example is the Hmong culture, which I will write here because there's an H in the beginning, but you don't really pronounce it. So it's like Hmong. It's an Asian, Southeast Asian culture. And this book on the slide, I'm not requiring you to read it, but it's called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. Anne Fadiman wrote this book because she was working with a Hmong culture in the US. And there was a family where the little girl had epilepsy, where she would have very big seizures. And in truth, epilepsy and epileptic seizures can look very different, but hers were the very dramatic ones that can cause harm. The problem is the American doctors were viewing her as something to cure. They were saying, oh, we can cure her epilepsy. We can put her on this medication. It'll stop the seizures. But her parents were saying, we don't want to stop the seizures. And the doctors were confused by this because the Western medical field says, you want to stop that, put a stop to that. The Hmong culture is saying, when somebody experiences a seizure, the mystical part is that they're being possessed by a spirit, not in a scary way like American movies, but in a good way. That basically she's being visited by an ancestral spirit who's speaking through her and moving through her. And it's supposed to be a beautiful kind of holy experience. So Fadiman had to kind of walk between two worlds and talk to the doctors who were trying to cure it and talk to the family that didn't want it to go away and kind of try to find middle ground and say, okay, well, let's not cure her seizures, but let's lessen the severity so that she's not thrashing around, she doesn't hurt herself. And if she does have a grand mal seizure that's really big like that, let's teach her parents how to protect her, because you can thrash around and you might knock into something and hurt yourself. So they taught them things like, putting pillows around her or something like that. So it was really about finding a balance between the two cultures. Now, naturalistic is when we explain illness in impersonal terms. That is Western biomedicine, looking at things like viruses, pathogens. And emotionalistic is when we assume emotional experiences cause illness. One of the great examples is susto, or soul loss through fright. So within some Central American cultures, there is this concept of susto. And usually what it looks like is someone goes through a traumatic event, could be war, could be famine, could be just, a bad car accident, something traumatic. And it alters their brain chemistry. And they come out the other side a little changed. They're a little more skittish. They're a little more stressed. Maybe they have trouble sleeping, things like that. For Western biomedicine, we would say that sounds a lot like PTSD. That's pretty much what's happening. They would say it's not PTSD, it's susto. You got scared so bad you lost part of your soul. Now, the good thing is, and as an anthropologist, we're not there to argue with them and say, no, you didn't. That's baloney. It's PTSD. There's no point in that. Now, what we can do is say, okay, well, it's not PTSD. It's soul loss. Got it. But it sounds like a lot of similar side effects. So maybe we can institute what's helped our people with PTSD, medications, therapy. Let's try it. Let's try it with Susto and see if it works. And ideally, what you want to do is help the people. We're not there to argue and say, no, that's baloney. It's not a spirit that's possessing her. It's epilepsy. It does no good to argue with people. And it's not going to, even if we change their mind, it's not going to change the outcome. But really, we can try to just help them.
You believe in game? Lost, or do you have any belief in game, or is it just lost altogether?
I think from what I've heard, just lost, but that is interesting. I don't know. Now I see, that's what I mean. Now I'm intrigued. Now tonight I'm not going to sleep. I'm going to be like, hold on. Okay, so you can like gain the soul back a little bit.
It just says, like little, your soul jumps out of your body.
Okay.
Which, I mean,
And,
that isn't too far-fetched from our own history. I think of like saying bless you when we sneeze is tied to people thinking like it's like your soul escaping and we gotta bless you. Put that back in.
shut down.
Looking at industrialization, that is development of industry in countries and regions. So when we see industrialization, modernization, looking at factories, mass producing things, there's pros and cons. The pro is we have developed through medical science the development of life-saving drugs. That is wonderful. Insulin is one of them. I think of, I don't know that we have a name for the cure yet, but they cured HIV/AIDS in someone recently, which is pretty exciting because that's one that has not had a cure for a long time. So it's going to be a while before there's like an over-the-counter cure, but it's progress. So those are some pros. I would say that's really good advancement. The cons is there's unequal access to those life-saving drugs. If you are on any medication prescribed, you know how expensive prescriptions are. I'm not going to lie, there are a couple of prescriptions that I kind of pick and choose. I'm technically prescribed Adderall. Adderall is expensive as hell. They also treat me like a drug dealer every time I pick it up. And I'm like, nope, still have ADHD, wasn't magically cured in a month. Still got it, gonna have it forever. But it doesn't always work, and it's very expensive. So sometimes I opt not to pick that prescription up because I'm like, it's not life-saving for me. So I'll just opt without it because it's $50, and maybe I don't feel like spending $50 on it. Similarly, if you need life-saving medication, sometimes people get desperate. I am not going to encourage illegal activity, especially in Michigan being close to Canada, who has universal health care. Some Americans who can't afford things like insulin will go on a little trip into Canada and then smuggle the insulin back with them. That is technically illegal. That is why I'm saying don't do that. Stop you. But some people, you get desperate enough. Similarly, but not quite the same as globalization, the kind of shrinking of our globe. The actual globe isn't getting smaller, but our access to each other is getting faster and easier. So realistically, if you think of something big that happened, like the sinking of the Titanic, When it sank, the first people I think, well, the first people that found out were the people that were there. The next were probably New York City because they were expecting the ship to come into port and it didn't show up. So they were the first ones to go, something bad happened, something happened. So people in New York would have found out pretty quickly. People in Michigan, this would have been, what was it, 1912? No texting, no TikTok, no TVs. Around there, yeah, early 1900s. And we would have found out about the sinking of Titanic way later because it would have had to have been a New York Post, which would have been picked up by a national post, which would have eventually trickled into Michigan. Now, because of globalization and modern technology, I find out about things happening on the other side of the world as they're happening, which is both amazing and sometimes I have to turn the magical screen off and just decompress and be like, you're taking in way more information than your ancestors ever did. Take a break, Stephanie. But I think it wasn't a like natural disaster, but an Icelandic volcano erupted a year or so ago. And I found out on TikTok from people that had to evacuate a spa. And then like 20 minutes later, I got the news update that was like, oh, there's a volcano erupting in Iceland. And I'm like, I know, because I just saw people filming it. I might run out of time today, so I probably won't ask you about the Halili article on the exam, because unfortunately I didn't get to it. So we'll see how I go. We've got like 4 minutes. Business anthropology looks at qualitative consumer research. So anytime you've ever gone to a business and they give you your receipt. I worked at a clothing store where every single receipt I had to say, there's a code at the bottom, a QRC code, and if you do it and you do the survey, you get 10% off your next purchase. Every time. Yeah. Oh, I used to tease one of the gals I worked with because she used her customer service voice on me once, and I was like, hey, don't use that fake voice on me. But that is qualitative consumer research. We're asking you, okay, why did you pick us? Is there anything we can do better? Sometimes we do focus groups where we actually get a group of people together. And let's say we want to change Coca-Cola and we come out with Coca-Cola Lime again. And we'll have a focus group where we have a group of people. Some are diehard Coca-Cola fans, some are diehard Pepsi fans, and we have them drink the new Coca-Cola, and then they sit and talk amongst themselves and tell us what they liked and didn't like. Public anthropology is efforts to extend anthropology's visibility beyond academia and to demonstrate its public policy relevance. So Western Michigan University, I don't know if they still do. Unfortunately, the department's changed a lot. Their anthropology department used to partner with Fort St. Joseph, which is a fort that's no longer there in southwestern Michigan, and they excavated. And once a year in the spring, they would have a public event where there would be historians and reenactors. So you kind of got a little glimpse of what the little village area would have looked like. And then they showed you the archaeology fieldwork. Now, where it was a little disappointing to the general public is they're thinking, oh my God, they're going to show us the archaeology. It's going to look like Indiana Jones. This is going to be amazing. And then we bring them to the field and they say, that is a field with holes in it. And we say, yes, that is archaeology. And it's a little lackluster, but it is kind of helpful to get people to understand what archaeology really looks like. Yeah, sometimes it might be exciting with gold artifacts. Sometimes it's finding an old rosary and being absolutely thrilled. It may not be as exciting. Sometimes it's just digging in the dirt. So I'm going to stop there. We technically had like 2 or 3 slides. Online, you do have a group activity where you are reverse engineering from a grocery order. Spoiler alert, there is no correct or wrong answer because I made all those grocery orders up. I just made them up. Years ago, I did delivery for Shipt, and I caught myself being nosy, and I'd go grocery shopping for someone, and I'd be doing that. I'd be trying to think like, what are they doing? They making tacos? What are you doing? Because I'm nosy. So that's what that activity is about. So the last three slides I will skip. I will not cover them on the exam because that's not fair. We didn't get to them. Yeah, otherwise you're free to go. Drive safely. I'll see you next week.